Give back. Hey, I'll give everyone time keys in the chat. Let's begin. Can I have first prop, please?
Wait, do I start now?
You're good to go.
Are you sure? Okay, cool. Okay, again, you eyes verbally. Okay, just give me a second. If anything, if there are no other issues, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it is time we step up against corporations from influencing the integrity of academia with the corrupt narrative that they wish to blind society with. The proposition presents a simple solution to this, which is simply to ban corporate sponsorship of research within academic institutions. A few things before I want to do in my setup before I get into my main arguments. Firstly, what do we think these corporate sponsorships look like in the status quo? We think that these corporate sponsorships towards academic or educational institutions are often tied with conditions to fund specific research projects that corporates are interested in, right? This looks like research being funded by corporates towards gender pay gap or military weapons, where corporations have stepped in order to fund certain areas of this academia. Why do we then think this is something that is inherently problematic? We think this is problematic for 2 reasons. One, because we think that corporations have an inherently unfair advantage through lobbying and funding research in these academic institutions. And 2, as a result of that, we think that this severely hurts the integrity of academia, right? What is the model coming under our side of the house? Under our side of the house, we will ban any form of corporate sponsorship that is tied with funding specific research projects in academic or educational institutions. As for donations, we do not prefer donations either, but it is not our burden in this debate to address the issue as well. Where do we then get funding from under our side of the house? We say that under our side of the house, we mainly get fundings from NGOs or public donations or through these educational institutions themselves. We say that there is supposed to be no sort of corporate funding involved under our side of the house whatsoever.
Points.
The proposition has to prove that insofar as academic research becomes worse off under their side of the house, along with the inherent harms to that, we win this debate. Op has to prove why, even at the extent of all the possible harms we push to them, they can still get better research under their side of the house. Before I get into my arguments, I'll take Varun's point.
This is sustained research over often years that costs billions of dollars. Why are NGOs able to supply the same amount of money that MNCs with billions in revenue every year are?
So, okay, yeah, even if you say that this research is something that takes billions of dollars, one, I think that the problem and the nuance to this is that corporations don't necessarily fund research that is benevolent, right? The nuance to this is that we say that companies often want to fund research that is skewed within the specific, skewed towards their favor, which is something I'll answer why it's problematic later on in my speech. Right. How does this hurt the academic integrity of research? Firstly, because we think that corporates have incredibly large amounts of capital that they can invest into academic or educational institutions to fund their research, right? We think that this looks like big corporations or MNC with huge amounts of money available to invest into R&D, pouring money into these educational institutions, right? We think that corporates are likely to fund research that specifically aligns with their goals and justifies negative activity, right? Things like climate change or the extent of damage caused by externalities, funding research that specifically states that somehow mitigates the amount of externalities that they produce as a result of their actions, right? We think that these are things that are inherently bad, right? We think that this research is likely to be bad for a few reasons, right? One, because we think that companies use the credibility of third-party research because it is far more believable than providing their own research, right? Say, for example, if ExxonMobil funds their own research saying that, oh, drilling into seabed is not as harmful, we're far more likely to be skeptical about this. But if, like, say, for example, Yale posts research about this sponsored by companies, that's the confirmation bias we get from a certified third-party educational institution that has verified this research, and we're much more likely to believe that it is true. Therefore, it is harder to conduct check and balances against these research, right? But secondly, we also think that this research is something that is likely to be corrupt as well, right? We think that the process of skewing factual information is far more likely to happen in order to secure sponsorship from companies, right? We think that this is true because educational institutions have to specifically align with the goals of companies and prove that this research aligns with their goals in order to secure their sponsorship. And they're likely to do this in many unbenevolent ways under their side of the house. Therefore, there's also a lack of accountability against these institutions and corporate companies. But thirdly, we say that any other form of research that isn't necessarily funded by these big companies gets flushed out of the process as well, right? So other institutions that don't have access to the same funding that these big corporations poured into specific academic institutions aren't likely to be considered in the very first place, which ruins the whole nature of finding finding appropriate academia with contesting perspectives through research. Why is this comparatively better under our side of the house, right? We think that the credibility of academia becomes far better under our side of the house because it's no longer skewed by the influence of big companies at the point in which we ban companies from influencing this research. We think that these educational or academic institutions are far more likely to operate within their own interest, and that their research isn't likely to be skewed in any form of way that is corrupt by any monetary gain. But before that, I'll take a final point.
Post the opioid crisis, there are both hefty fines and massive regulations that prevent corporations from the most criminal forms of biased research. Realistically then, why is your research harmful when those who read it are academics who are able to draw relatively objective personal conclusions?
Okay, so I think there's two problems with this. One is that you don't necessarily prove either why research isn't necessarily going to be skewed under your side of the house. Even if you do have some form of regulation that supposedly acts against companies trying to skew research, right? There's no reason to believe why this doesn't happen under your side of the house. We say that we simply, that by the moment in which you ban any form of corporate sponsorship towards these forms of research, therefore we can eliminate any form of risk of misinformation through research. But the second thing that I want to address, the second response to that is to say that I think that at the other nuance we gave to you was that at the point in which you do have other educational institutions or third parties providing this information for you, people are far more likely to believe this. We already told you the analysis as to why people are more likely to believe academic institutions as opposed to companies posting their own forms of research. But two final preemptions I want to get into before I end my speech. The first preemption I want to say is that Op will probably say that they get better research under their side of the house because of better funding. Sure, they may get fundings to better things such as technology and the necessary capital for research, but it doesn't answer the root problem that we brought to you from the very beginning of this debate, which is to say that the nuance was that research would be corrupt in the very first place because of the corporate influence of lobbying and whatsoever, right? So you still have to address the nuance of why then research under your side of the house will not be corrupt. But the second thing is that they will probably say that there are incentives to maintain integrity within research, even with the presence of corporate influence. I think that this is highly unlikely to happen, right? Simply because corporates will pull out their funding from institutions that do not support their research and would rather invest in other academic institutions. We think that because of this, academic institutions are forced to skew in the favor of these corporations so that they're able to secure sponsorship and funding for their very own benefit. For all these reasons, we hope that, you will step up against these corporations and side with proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, first prop. Can I have first prop?
I'm not audible.
Yep, you're good.
POS, if I believe, right? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition would think that it got away with this debate by giving you a laundry list of the malevolent interests of corporations. But they needed to realize that that wasn't sufficient. The direct action of cutting the funding of these academic institutions and is going to cause them to be solely responsible for the contraction in the volume of academic research and the lack of sustained knowledge in academia. Some important characterizations that got completely screwed over. Firstly, what is this research actually going to look like? Firstly, we think that this is going to be long-term research. So this is going to be research that is going to be heavily expensive to carry out for all forms of institution. So you're going to need things like sustained cash injections, because perhaps if it's things like mass clinical trials, you're going to need a lot of money to do things like remanufacturing these products. So government's analysis here on them wanting to use NGOs to then instead supply these academic research was not going to be feasible, because no matter how much people donate towards NGOs, the money that you got from NGOs was never going to be comparable towards the money you got from MNCs. Secondly, I think that these forms of research were ultimately going to lead to procurement of higher volume of these research papers. I think this was something that was uniquely attainable on opposition. Gov needs to bite the bullet here and concede to that. Secondly, what are these corporations actually going to look like, and what's going to be their long-term incentives? Firstly, we think that these are companies that are ultimately going to have some kind of interest in the research papers they want to see them published, right? These are going to be relatively, to some degree, biased incentives. They might want them to have to lean towards their sides, but we think that we've got ways of mitigating this. Secondly, we think that these are going to be potentially bigger corporations that are going to influence things like the medical industry, the technological industry, and even things like the social economic sector. We think these are all of the forms of like benefits that we can actually attain on. I'm going to expand later on why all of these things are important. But some pieces of framing here. How exactly do we secure academic integrity on opposition? Four-pronged model here, which is going to directly engage with proposition's claims. Firstly, the reputation of these academic institutions themselves. We tell you that these academic institutions are likely going to be incredibly big ones because they're going to be attracting the most amount of academic sponsorship. So universities like Oxford, Harvard, Yale, and all the Ivies across the country. These are all universities that are going to be susceptible towards the limelight of the public. So it's going to be easy for these big names to be taken down or tarnished on the news. So they have direct incentives here to want to not publish blatant lies that prop would suggest, because these things very obviously tarnish their reputation if they were to be called out. So in the sense that they might lose things like college applications if there's an expose on Harvard publishing information saying that opioids aren't harmful. Secondly, on the increased regulation and the industry itself. I think after things like the opioid crisis and things like false publishing from universities there, it's led to an increase in government regulation and scrutiny of these papers that universities publish, right? So you have things like state fact checkers who go through these papers that are published. And ultimately, if companies still breach this, you get the highest amounts of fines, right? Because the effects are tantamount. So it compounds in the long term. So post-opioid crisis, companies like Moderna and Insys were all fined in the millions, even bankrupting Insys. We think then there's an obvious corporate disincentive here to want to publish against publishing damaging research. Thirdly, onto the readers of the research themselves. We think these are people who are going to be self-controlled, whom are going to be actually mitigating a lot of the harms. Because we think the readers here aren't going to be your average common man, right? It's probably going to be big doctors, economists, people in the technological sector who have high positions. These are people whom are well-read and they can come to their own conclusions with the sufficient knowledge they already hold. So they ought to think for themselves. So even if papers outright lie, they can very obviously see through it. They can look past bias. We think they're not going to be as susceptible to influence that government might suggest. Lastly, onto the counterbalance mechanism of independent researchers and other companies themselves. Talking about companies themselves, right? We think these, just because all corporations may be profit incentive, we think there still may be capacity for them to want to publish positively biased research papers, which are socially progressive, right? Because these are the kinds of research papers that potentially attract more consumers towards them, making them look more woke. Secondly, we think there's still a presence of independent researchers whom are going to be fact-checking, and they're going to be non-biased and willing to call them out. But here we take prop at their very best and we bite the bullet. We say there's potential to be leaning towards their side of these corporations. But once again, we don't think it's going to be blatant lies. At its very worst, we think that we still get some form of research in higher volume that is going to be some form of relatively biased, but opposition is willing to bite the bullet here and say that's still fine, even though given the fact that we get higher amounts of volume, which is going to be self-regulating. And the metric here is incredibly simple. It's simply volume versus quality. Insofar as Gov can prove to you that we achieve greater volume and we simultaneously protect quality to our best, we still think we can vote, because not that still think we can win, because no matter what Gov says, they will definitely lose the clash on volume. I'll take that later. First argument here on the principle on the importance of research and its academic consumption. First here as to why research papers that academic institutions publish are a critical importance towards society itself. I think the importance of the volume of papers here is largely marginalized by government. We posit to you that on propositions work, Gov contracts the volume of research that's pumped out, because it's important to note that propositions counter model of alternative means of money wasn't going to stand. But note that there's a lot of unique importance here when it comes to volume. We think we can use the same free market principles that Prop hate so much. We think the way in which you maintain integrity and secure value, all the things that government wants here, and you ensure the most highest quality form of a research paper is when many institutions have the capacity to pump out these research papers. We think that's the world where in which you have these research papers counterbalancing and self-regulating one another. Because if you're going to be living on propositions work, you're going to see the most privileged forms of institutions that are going to be capable of publishing these research papers, which means that the volume or the metric of scale of research papers that you get are going to be heavily diluted, meaning to say that a lot of the research that comes out is going to be centric around a single audience, or is going to be centric around a single topic. And that's when you don't see things like diversified research papers. That's when you don't see things like a counterbalancing of opinions. But on our side of the house, we can prove to you to some degree that you have counterbalancing opinions that are able to take out these companies. But secondly, on why can these academic institutions even achieve the best form of research? I think this is simply because of the quality of researchers present in these universities to begin with. So these are going to be people who are going to be academics from the biggest universities, right? They're going to be academics from universities like Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. But I'll take a POI now.
If research was so expensive, why would corporations spend billions just to look good when media campaigns and pinkwashing is so much cheaper?
The reason as to why they want to look better via research is because research is a little bit more credible than media. Media is much easier to take out, right? Because you can just paint it as false news, you can paint it as misinformation, but research is a little bit more factually backed up. I hope that answers the question. But I think secondly, on us to the vast amount of equipment that these universities themselves have, I think you're likely to get the most best form of research or the highest quality of research on our side when you're giving it towards these universities, because these are universities that are probably going to have the biggest forms of equipment. So they probably, when you look at things like technological or medical research, you're going to need things like vast amounts of capital intensive production, right? So you're going to need a lot of equipment to even produce these forms of research to begin with, because of things like the mass production of things like clinical trials for drugs, or even things like trying to study statistical analysis for things like economic research. We think all of these things are exclusively present when it comes down to academic institutions. But government's counter model doesn't deal with this, because their proposition is to allow NGOs to instead do this. But note that NGOs were never going to be able to have sufficient amounts of money towards giving it towards universities, meaning to say that these universities were never going to be able to get the highest amount of capital to purchase these capital equipments, pay their researchers even more, and publish the best forms of research. I think government loses on that clash, and I think for all those reasons, side with all.
Thank you for stop. Can I have second prof?
I prefer my POIs verbally. And I'm going to assume I'm audible.
Yep, you're good.
Right. Okay, start my speech. This debate was never about whether the research by corporations or corporate innovations bring benefit to society. Because these corporation innovations can happen on either side of the house. Note that corporations oftentimes have their own labs to do all of this innovation. What they do with universities is asking universities to prove that their products are actually beneficial, to prove a certain outcome that their products actually work, so that as opposition say, you have more credibility with your product. The reason as to why this is true is because if the public university or private university, which are educational institutions, are the ones doing this innovation for your own product or for your innovation, this means that this is something that's a public good that cannot be patented. A lot of corporations do have the incentive to want to patent their own researchers to say that it is their company and their people that done this. This is exactly why, as to the most important innovations are likely to be done by private institutions and not educational institutions on either side of the house. Note that this is really important because this frames out the whole of LO's speech in talking about why then this innovation is something that's important or not. I'll take you later. With that being said, this debate is about in terms of what is the thing that's actually in line of education. Because if all of these innovations can happen on both sides of the house, we need to talk about the specific types of research that these educational institutions do and what's best for their education and only for their education. Before I go on, I'll take the POI.
No, then corporations just don't carry out this research because it was only credible when it came from academic institutions. It is far more likely then they go into things like bribery because it's more easy to do that in your world when they can't opt into legal research.
If they want to do research to benefit their products and to have better products to sell on the market, I'm not sure why that isn't a good enough return of investment for them to break the ceiling and go into more innovation in the first place. With that being said, let's answer the first question that comes strongest from side of opposition. Have enough funds to do the research that is needed. The first question here is, do we really need that much of funds? Because opposition firstly says that you need a lot of money to remanufacture all of these products. But I don't think that we really need to remanufacture them on a really large scale. We just need enough to be able to carry out the researches. All of these things are oftentimes already achievable because we have the equipments in most universities, especially those who are known to a certain extent. We think that the equipments are there present in all the universities, which is exactly why we're able to carry it out as well. The second thing that's said is that it's a really long-term thing. Exactly because it's spread along a long term of time, this is why we can gather enough resources by then. But the crucial thing is here that opposition completely neglected our counter mechanisms of how we get funds. We get things like public funding, like NGOs. It is not true that NGOs don't have enough money because public funding, especially in status quo, when it's so and people then oftentimes do have the social consciousness to want to invest in all these things because of the social norm of looking good, of being able to post on Instagram, or even people like celebrities who want to donate to all this to all of these NGOs just to look and have benefit their reputation are the same mechanisms that also exist on our side of the house. This is exactly why we're going to have enough resources. But even if not, we argue that we actually have more resources on our side of the house because absent of the corporate funding, we have a reason at worst to say that we lack the funds. We can have this reason to have more fundraisings. We can have all of these reasons to have policies put in place to put actual money in education instead of in our defense. Note that this then creates even more money for these educational institutions, as opposition says all of these corporations are then profit incentivized. They will not put so much money in education. With that being said, I think it's true that we proved that the money needed for research is actually enough on our side of the house. We don't think we need that much money to actually do research in the first place. The second question then comes, let's assume that opposition has more money. Does having more money actually bring social good? And is actually having more money meaning that the research that you do actually brings social good? Opposition says that you will not have blatant lies. We agree that there will not be blatant lies. What we're arguing is that the reason of you doing the research is to prove a specific outcome instead of exploring even more. This changes the incentives of universities in how they operate. This is exactly why even if you have a lot of innovation or even a lot of research, it oftentimes only focuses on what benefits the corporations instead of what benefits the people on the ground. Because corporations only want to prove what is best for their product oftentimes. This is exactly why even if you have a lot of money and do a lot of research and perfect research on side of opposition, the goals are actually not in line with social good, and that is the problem. Opposition then says you are likely to want to do good research. The problem with this is their own characterization by saying that it needs billions of money and a lot of a lot of commitment by these corporations. The counterfactual is having a lot of media narratives. They say that people won't believe in the media. Panel, I want you to think that is this true? People oftentimes are really easily influenced by the media, and you don't need to convince all academia. You just need to convince the people on the ground to continue using your product so that they do not have enough mass to vote for policies against you and do not have enough mass to boycott you or protest against you. The problem then comes with that a lot of the innovations that they want to talk about and a lot of the good research that they want to talk about can still exist on our side of the house. But we need diversification on our side and to not only focus on the researchers that benefit corporations, and that's why we then clearly win on side of proposition. Lastly then, I want to go on to a new argument on education. And why is it exclusively on side of proposition that we achieve the goals of education? Because note, educational institutions was never to benefit society. Their researchers was never mainly to have innovation or societal good. It's to educate people so that the students in the universities, the people who are doing their masters, can solidify their skills to explore science and learn even more so that they can be useful members of the society in the future. The first problem here is the diversity. Because note that let's say that you do have some good research on side of opposition, but the mass is then significantly lower. Like the quantity of good research and the societally progressive research is just significantly lower because no corporations want to spend half of their money on all of these things just to look good instead of spending on things that actually benefit the corporations. The comparative on our side is that if no one can spend money, if universities do not have the incentive to take up corporations' money just to go to research because everyone is on an equal ground, you are more likely to accept money from NGOs. You're also more likely to accept money from public funding instead of corporations. This then has a diversity in the types of research because firstly, you're not bounded by all of this education, not bounded by corporations. But secondly, then, if innovation exists on either side, then it's true that educational institutions should focus on other things that are not in innovation for the companies. In that case, they only have research about innovation for companies, and we have both innovation for companies and innovation that are not for companies. The second problem with opposition is that you don't actually explore because a lot of these things are to achieve a certain outcome, whereas on our side of the house, you get to have the good values of trying to explore more. This is crucial for future research because we don't always just research what we already know. We need to be able to explore more things, even if it doesn't have a true or a very clear social good or a clear good for the return of investment. These are always the means and the reasons as to why we always achieve the best kinds of breakthroughs, and these things are just non-existent on side of opposition. The last thing here is good values. We don't want to change a bunch of students who are just doing research to benefit organizations, benefit corporations, or just to earn money. A lot of these things causes less independent researchers on side of opposition, which is the mechanism that they prioritize, because a lot of these students are shaped to only research to do things that are beneficial for corporations. And for those reasons, we think education is the main goal of educational institutions, not corporations, not social good. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you, second prop. Can I have second op?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Nice. PYs verbally once again, and I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The proposition, like the corporations they characterize, are incredibly biased. But unlike this debate room, there were fundamental structures within the real world that minimize the nature of that biased research. They hint the primary justification of their case on. Let's take that down. And by that, I mean bring back what Divvesh said, because they clearly were not listening. 4 reasons to why this is true. Firstly, we talked about academic and journalistic incentives and integrity. That goes to say institutions like Harvard or Oxford have active incentives to report favorably again, that reputation was earned by being integral in the way they reported. I think that gives them great abilities to influence and gain corporate sponsorships. For that reason alone, I think there is active incentives for them to be genuine, or to a large extent, in terms of their reporting. But secondly, on corporate fine incentives, note, post things like the opioid crisis, the corporations that funded the research that said they weren't addictive were funded billions of dollars. That were fundamental corporate restructurings in which their executives were hired. Not just do these corporations now fear the very fact that they could be biased, the individuals who control them also fear losing their jobs. I think we deal with that incredibly well. But lastly, on regulation, I think countries have learned this very well. You have incredibly strong regulation that prevents corporations from misinformation. Frankly, it could lead to them being deplatformed everywhere. There is no way they're actually able to get the word out about how beneficial their product is or how it aligns with research. I think that is far, far more harmful. We've basically taken down your case. We win so clearly. But onto a burden here, because I think some clear pushing needs to be done. It wasn't to prove the lack of importance of research which comes out in Sue Pei. It was to stick with Alex and prove why you got the best version of it. That's solely, I think, that lacks case coherency here. But even then, you weren't frankly able to prove any form of research existing. On to the macro then, as to how you get no research in your world, specifically how you get no important research in your world. First layer, the comparative exists on a scale of quantifiable research. Firstly, while the prop may have completely unbiased research, it lacks in two things. One, quantity. We say you get far, far less research here. I'm talking like 80-90% less, because literally all their research is driven by socially progressive corporations who want, above all, to please consumers and win state favor. Secondly, the type of research that exists and why it is incredibly harmful. First layer, Divvesh does a brilliant job here telling you how costly this research can be and that it was almost exclusively funded by corporations. Sue Pei goes on to tell you, oh, we already have this equipment. It isn't that expensive. I think this shows you how unaware they are as to what they're in terms of characterization. It is billions of dollars in extended research that looks like things like clinical trials, trying out new prototypes, going on the ground and paying individuals to test out your product or take your survey, and this goes over multiple years. It is incredibly strenuous. On top of that, you have to compensate the research institution and the scientists who carry out the research. It is incredibly costly. Absent of this, what kind of research existed then? We posit academic institutions simply no longer have incentives to carry out incredibly costly research out of their own pockets when the benefit is often purely reputational and marginal, especially when they have to spend billions of dollars realistically, which they don't even have in the first place. But realistically then, you hear no response to my POI to Alex as to why NGOs were even able to supply that at very minimum $2 to $3 billion price tag per research when it came to social testing and clinical trials. Anyways, this was their best case. Realistically, you get no research at all. We were willing to engage in that best case. They were never willing to reciprocate. Lastly, then, as to how your research likely does not address the most important issue that individuals care about. 3 reasons. Firstly, we prove academics no longer have incentive to carry it out. Here's why corporations have that incentive in our world, on top of the fact that it's likely to be unbiased, which we already proved. Secondly, these corporations in status quo oftentimes look like companies that intend to have research done to A, make their presence in the field known, or B, correlate with their products or business directions. That goes to say, I, for example, as Pfizer, want to be credited with the company that funded groundbreaking research on the kinds of vaccines that could be used and how to make vaccines more accessible in like third world countries. Additionally, it looked like them actually opting into healthy business practices to align with those research. On top of the fact that we prove there are incredibly high incentives to not do dodgy things and be biased or shady business practices, it then looks, when you have really good research, companies actively move to that direction or shape their products to in some way honor that research, because that is the only way in which they feel they're able to swing consumers. Divvesh does this incredibly well by telling you how influential that research is to consumers. Lastly then, if anything, this leads to a far, far better product and corporate practices that actively align with it because of how beneficial it can be in winning over those consumers, especially when we prove the fundamental inability to be blatantly biased. This leaves me perplexed, because if Alex and Sue Pei spend so much time talking about why this research is important simply in the issues it addresses because they feed into their own problem here, you need to share a response to their case tension immediately, because the very fact they say it's important, they don't have any of it, is, I just think, a problem solution mismatch. But before I go on into my second layer, Sue Pei, I'll take you up on that point. Defend yourself.
Universities want to be reputable to get public and NGO funding so they can survive. Why does the same incentive exist if they now primarily depend on corporate funding?
I don't think that's true, but yeah, like that's the entire point. Like they depend on corporate funding. Like that's the kind of research we want. In your world, you just don't get any of that research because you no longer have a gain or realistic deal in which with billions of dollars is which that incredible amount of research to get. I think it is far, far better when universities churn out research from corporations. We've talked to you about its merits and why it specifically is so beneficial. You're going to hear now, right now, why it is so beneficial that corporations specifically dictate the research. But note then, why is it bad in your world that you don't get the kind of research we do? I think this characterizes the importance of research. By the end of this particular segment, you're going to hear, frankly, why we win on this clash. Firstly, Divvesh's brilliant analysis here goes unresponded to. This research wasn't just fundamental to furthering human expertise in the field like economics and medical care or things like academics, but we say academics make crucial decisions on its basis that affected people on the ground. What does that look like? We prove to a large part it's relatively unbiased and addresses highly important issues. That goes to say, like the New York Times or like an academic research institution like Harvard could write an incredibly detailed paper and give you objective analysis and have their own conclusion of it. We say the academics who read it have their own like expertise, their own conclusions. That is why you have such a contested and discourse-filled academic world. But let's be clear, it looked like, for example, calming markets when Berkshire Hathaway's funds research that proposes stable interest rates and medical research that addresses euthanizing terminally ill patients. But I'm willing to engage with your very best case here. We bite the bullet. This engages with Sue Pei directly. Even if your research was incredibly biased or untrue, its conception created discourse, crucial discourse that led to awareness and social change, especially post things like the opioid crisis, when people are so incredibly aware and co-cooperation at such a large standard. This is likely to get incredible policy change and social awareness. I think we win on the mitigation of research bias, but we bite your bullet and we win it at its best there. But we say on Sue Pei then, on how Sue Pei claims corporations are just going to do research themselves anyways. I think this is far, far worse. Why is this untrue? Because the very reason they went to academic institutions was those institutions had like credibility and swing. The moment this is not true, like you said, it is far more convenient to just bribe and start bribing like doctors on the ground. I think that is far, far worse. In your world, even when the risk exists, it is the only way they're ever going to get any form of help for their corporate product. I think it is far, far worse then. Why do we frame out the worst corporations? What does the average corporation look like? Most importantly, they're not the criminals of the opioid crisis. We already have regulations against that. We say corporations in status quo look like companies that intend to have research done to make their presence known. We've talked about incentives and why that is true. Therefore, this debate, even at worst, cannot be about the worst instances of corporate research abuse. The prop does not operate within its parameters then. To what extent does bias exist? I think it really isn't that important. We win this debate so clearly, never prouder to oppose.
Okay,
Mike, can I run to the toilet?
sure. Then everyone take a minute.
I'm back.
Okay, third prop.
Hello. I'll take my PRS voice. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. In a global framework of capitalism and profit incentives, the accumulation of capital has given corporations a domineering role in dictating societal norms and dictating the sort of values that society places within the largest problems that face us. This debate, Madam Speaker, was not about corporate innovation or not about the minutiae of funding that was going to be interchanged on either side of the house and calculating how many billions and how many billions of dollars each side got. It wasn't about things like market research, because what we identified in the first two speeches that they failed to engage with was a premise that the corporations and the effect that they have on society was one that affected more than just innovation and how much technology and how advanced our technological systems could advance to. It was a cultural normative effect that so many of these corporations were now beginning to embrace. And as a result of this sponsorship and a result of increased lobbying, were able to manifest into realities and to negative externalities for vulnerable individuals. So I'm going to talk about a few things in this speech here. But the first thing I would like to point out is just the problem of the opposition strategy within the round and tell you exactly which parts are more important. The first thing I want to point out here is that I think opposition just draws a very peculiar distinction between the target audiences of this research. So obviously neither side so far has really characterized as to what extent this research is likely to lead and how it exactly works. The problem here is that opposition takes the logic of saying, well, if it is published within the academic circle, then the only people who are going to read it are academics, and therefore they are able to be subject to the same kind of journalistic integrity, things like academic discourse and a desire for diversity of ideas. And in terms of the information that gets down to media houses and to people, that is completely separate from the information that we get within these academic circles. The important thing I want to point out here is that regardless of where this information does or what it does, this was information that was probably and most likely going to bleed out and skew public opinion regardless. The first thing they need to understand is the current system of media is incredibly multi-tiered in the way that it functions. As in, we no longer live in the 1900s where it's just, people publish reports and then in order to understand the ideas behind that report, you have to go and study at Harvard in order to understand the complex terminologies. The point is that a lot of media houses can just publish articles about simplifying these research reports, synthesizing them into minute and concise articles, and then putting a political rhetoric on that is easy to understand. And all of this means, especially in the rise of things like social media and the advanced ways in which media houses capture like public attention, and how to the incentive for these media houses and politicians to weaponize this research, to use it for political benefits, and the ways that it affects how individuals view certain values in terms of things like the environmental movement or things like other important issues like the gender pay gap. But how specifically do corporations unfairly dominate the market for academic research? This is what I want to point out, because importantly, as a product of the free market mechanism, corporations who use this free market mechanism to their severe advantage are able to dominate these markets. How do they do this? Firstly, what they do is that these corporations receive exclusive partnerships and buy their way into exclusive deals with credible research institutions, things like the Brookings Institution, for instance. They're able to use this specific platform uniquely because these are corporations who have a large amount of funding. The second thing they do is they do things like buy airtime on lower and more domestic scale media houses. These are things like when the only information and the only statistics that you get are published from an institution and published on CNN, and that is what the vast majority of people think. The one over what sort of information gets out. The third thing to note here is that they do things like hire the most credible speakers. They do things like hire the most credible professors in order to be the spearheading figure of these messages and these political narratives. That is why the free market is always beholden to the billions and dollars worth of excessive capital, and therefore cannot be regulated by the self-correcting market that the opposition wants to lagging. Screen's frozen.
Your screen's frozen. What did you say?
Oh yeah, my screen's. Oh, is it okay, right?
Yeah, it's okay. It's lagging a little bit, but I can still hear the points quite clearly. So.
All right, sorry about it.
Okay.
I'll resume in 3, 2, 1. So let's talk about the issue now about corporate strategies and the ways that the first and second proposition already established the harm that these corporations impose upon society. So the first thing they say in response to this whole argument is that the self-accountability exists to not publish lies within the media house. The first response to note here, probably the most important, is that our argument was just far more nuanced than that. So for instance, the most harmful narratives are oftentimes not founded upon complete lies, as the opposition would have you believe. Most of these narratives are founded upon half-truths, specific pieces of statistics and data that lead you to believe a certain manifestation of reality that might not necessarily be the most accurate, but there certainly is data to prove that. For instance, when you see research into the gender pay gap, it is legitimate to say that women, like in general, and that's like the major argument from conservatives, that women in general pick lesser paying jobs. But that is by no means an accurate representation of the equality that is necessary within the workplace and within corporations, and how that like patriarchal influence has affected the ways that women interact with each other. So on that basis, it's incredibly difficult for them to regulate that. But the second thing that they say is that, well, academics can just counterbalance corporate misinformation because they're like educated and they rationalize things. The first is that this is just a false representation of how this research manifests. The reality was something much more incentive, that journalistic incentives don't overcome executive decisions within these like institutions, right? Because obviously it's not a whole bunch of like independent researchers who are going to be displaying this information. Things like the Brookings Institution is made out of a hierarchy still within that institution. And the fact is that things like sponsorship and things like excessive amounts of capital are necessarily a quid pro quo, which is to say that if this corporation gives you a sponsorship and you do not reciprocate by like conveying those political narratives and strengthening those political narratives, then the moment that you retract from those things, the corporate sponsorship suddenly ends, and now you no longer have a funding base for that. The impact of this was incredibly large because what you do is you block out alternative perspectives on the side of opposition and you entrench political narratives that are harmful for the most vulnerable. Before I talk about funding and how we break this deadlock, I will take a POI.
Taking you at your best, academics have differing views on academic reports, regardless of their conclusions. This trickles down into articles with diverse opinions across the media because these academics are the individuals who write them out. Why then does your harmful bias still exist on a social level? Doesn't this deal with the...
Yeah, that's the problem. So I'm going to talk about this right now. The reason why these journalists aren't able to self-check each other is because the sponsorship for these corporations is like a market mechanism dominated by an oligopoly of corporations. So as you characterize, right, like it is true that research costs like a lot of money. The reason for that is because research generally lacks a distinctive roadmap. It oftentimes has arbitrary flag posts for success. So it is incredibly difficult for a corporation to envision this model being profitable for them. Therefore, the only corporations who are going to engage in this corporate sponsorship are the ones which have excessive capital that can outcompete every single other corporation within their industry and are likely to monopolize that market as a result. So it isn't true that corporate sponsorships are going to balance each other out or that media articles are going to balance each other out, because what corporations can do is they can hire a whole host of different journalists with that excessive capital in order to forward their political narratives. They're able to monopolize the market because they have that much money. But how much money does, and like how much money exactly does either side of the house have, and does it really matter at the end of the debate? Because we very clearly win on how this hurts political narratives and the harmful externalities. There, they don't engage with that whatsoever. But on the side of proposition, what we tell you is that it is likely that you get an increase in funding. The reason for this is quite interesting because when you have things for support for the environmental movement, it is something that is incredibly special because it isn't something that goes away on a day-by-day basis. It is something that is founded within a strong belief that the environment needs to be protected and that it is essential for green tech to be a part of the future. Varun's claim that we get no research on our side of the house just doesn't make any sense, because the question I want to ask here in terms of volume and the metric that they use is, what is the use of pumping out hundreds of thousands of papers like proving a specific research topic if all hundreds and thousands of those papers are centered purely around private and corporate interests that always come at the detriment of the environment, that always come at the detriment of the worst off within our societies? If volume was the metric, they could take this debate. But clearly it wasn't, because these corporations used volume as a way to escape corporate accountability and to forward harmful political narratives that at the end of the debate hurt things like the environment, hurt the treatment of hurt the equal treatment of women within the workplace. And for those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Okay, can I have third op?
Hi, sorry, I was just logged out from my Google Docs. I'm trying to reconnect.
Okay.
All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when research institutions do not get budget and technological advancement from viable actors on our side, research will only be equally poor quality on site government. We did not have to defend biasness on opposition. We only needed to prove why the quality of research happens better on our side. I think that we have sufficiently proved that throughout all 2 speeches that you have heard. But most crucially, the DLO and PM mentioned the reason that the opioid crisis was taken down. And these were like the biggest companies in the industry. And that was like essentially because of the academics on the ground who disagreed and contested on their reports. So we think that this example sufficiently justifies why our case still stands and this issue, we still win on this issue. And this is debate winning because it proves that like the more biased corporations are, the more biased corporations, there will be more discourse and contest towards the results of these reports. And there will generally be more accountability in our world, leading to reports being published by those academics who read the report, they have views on both sides of the spectrum. This was an analysis on the macro. It was extremely important throughout this debate. Now, let's address their comparative. Note that the entire case is hinged upon the effectiveness of their comparative, which was relying on NGOs for funding. We tell you that insofar as we prove that this was insufficient, we already automatically win this debate. So why was NGO insufficient? First, we say that on their best case, academic research isn't a priority for these NGOs, as they have multiple other causes to devote to. And second, their funds are very hard earned through donations and charity drives, etc. In order for them to attract funding, they're likely to get small amounts from each person. Given that their burden was the quality of research, on-site proposition wouldn't get the equipment, workforce, or facilities. Therefore, we say that research would be hindered on their side. And even at their best, note that the same harm that they do not want can also apply to NGOs, where there are scandals like corruption and incentives to gain more funds. Therefore, we say that generally, some NGOs on their spectrum do rely on philanthropic capitalism in the status quo, which revolves around corporations anyways. Now, moving on to biasness. Now, this is part of the weighing. On their first claim, they say that private institutions are more reliable than educational institutions, and educational institutions do not have an obligation to carry out corporate research. We say no. Vaccine, like for example, the vaccine revolutionary research was developed by Oxford University, etc. Therefore, we prove that educational institutions are extremely important for these kind of research because first, there's a concentration of elites and knowledgeable people within these universities. These look like PhD students or people who go to universities internationally to do research specifically. There's a reason in status quo that most research papers are published by universities as opposed to private research institutions. And even at their best, if we concede that even if we take that at their best, your private institutions are likely influenced by the same incentives to gain profit as well and suffer from the lack of funding. The comparative on our side is thus a better quality research. Now, second, we think they were extremely uncharitable in their framing because note that they literally did not engage with the possibilities of incentive alignment between these corporations and these educational institutions. Because 2 layers to this. First, during COVID, the corporations like vaccine companies funded universities to develop and research the vaccines. They were also profit-oriented. But even within the fight for profit, the volume and mass production and revolution in which we produce billions of vaccines of different variants in months. Therefore, we show that they can have a mutual goal in these circumstances. When you initiate a blanket ban in side proposition, you lose out on all of these things. And this is oftentimes crucial for extremely important things. For example, the breakthroughs that they were talking about. And second, even if you don't buy that, we told you we have counterbalance mechanisms and companies can be biased in a good way where they can research in positive areas. And we also told you that people hold them accountable even at best, and there will be checks and balances, which I proved from the beginning of this speech. And they also asserted that we get no research on things other than corporations. We already told you that academic research of different varieties do exist. For example, vaccines or the development of new drugs, etc. is not necessarily fully biased. It is also some form of information. This is why it aligns with the goals of education. And we also don't get what it's bad to follow the incentives of corporations. on two layers. First, we told you they likely will not be inherently biased, but only to a certain extent that does not bring excessive harm because of structural reasons like laws and regulation, etc. Second, insofar as it brought us research and funding for the development of these institutions to slowly grow stronger, they will be more likely to afford the viable alternatives in the future where they do not need to rely on this on like corporate funding. Now, weighing on accessibility, objected. First, we say that on our side, research or educational institutions who actually need the money will be unable to get it on site proposition because of first movement advantage. Research institutions with the largest budget and equipments, for example, Harvard and best reputation, have a chokehold over the industry, and any other institution will take asymmetrically more time in funding, especially when people opt for the renowned institutions, meaning without corporate funding, they get significantly less chances to develop. This happens on their side. This is harmful for academics in that region because it perpetually entrenches the R&D sector of a nation, which is often found in developing countries who cannot afford quality research. And this shrinks in research sectors. This puts the nation behind as a whole because when you ban all corporate and initiate a blanket ban, you only have a limited amount of choices left on their side. No, this engages with their claim on why lower ranked research institutions don't survive. They characterize this very conveniently. For example, framing companies as very evil figures. We told you this was too uncharitable. We took them at their best all this time, whereas they never did. There are likely a spectrum of corporations of different varieties that offer chances to these well-known institutions because of their cheaper price, etc. So when you have a blanket ban, you take away the chances of all of these benefits that only exist on our side. You take away the chances of the disadvantage to access crucial research. The weighing then on the presence of research. What did they tell you? They told you that rejected. They told you that we will have biased info and we will not get credibility. But we told you first that sponsorship leading to manipulation and bias is severely mitigated. Because first, it's unlikely to happen. Even if it does, it is mitigated for two reasons. First, the incentives of companies to uphold a certain extent of credibility, but there's no blatantly false info, whereas they're held accountable for their actions and information. Why is this true? Because when research is published to support cause, the research will be directly linked to that, meaning that the corporations themselves are in the forefront and their reputations are at stake. Second, we said that there are legal regulations in place, but there are specific laws that ensure you get punishments for misinformation, etc. Even when they breach it, it's only likely to be slightly biased. We told you from first that laws have tightened since the opioid crisis. They cannot argue on that basis. Even at best, we are willing to trade that off because the comparative on their side is that first, the NGO likely cannot sustain. Even if they do, they likely aren't enough for the variety that they want, especially since they don't get the benefits and quality they want. Because the public will not want to donate to a cause that they know of no success. And so we won in an individual path to victory because we proved we get research and quality research while benefiting less well-known academia, whereas they have to defend no research and limited at best poor quality research on their side with NGOs. So this is why we single-handedly win this debate. Please side for opposition.